The silver needle of rain pierced the October evening as Dr. Eleanor Blackwood hurried up the steps of Thornfield Institute. Her leather satchel, heavy with research papers, bumped against her hip with each step. The restored Victorian building loomed before her, its windows glowing amber against the premature darkness of the autumn afternoon. "You're late, Dr. Blackwood," said Professor Walsh, not looking up from the illuminated examination table where the portrait lay. His silver-rimmed spectacles caught the light as he leaned over the daguerreotype, a magnifying glass held steady in his liver-spotted hand. "My apologies," Eleanor said, shaking droplets from her coat. The university archives took longer than expected. She approached the table where 3 other figures stood in silent contemplation of the portrait. The scent of chemical preservatives hung in the air, mingling with the musty aroma of old paper and polish that seemed embedded in the walls of the institute. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Harrington from the National Gallery." Professor Walsh gestured to a thin man with a meticulously trimmed beard. "And Ms. Clark from the Historical Society." A woman with sharp eyes nodded curtly. "And, of course, you know Dr. Bennett." Eleanor exchanged a brief smile with Bennett, her former colleague. Their shared history, both professional and personal, lingered between them like a ghost. "Now that we're all here," Walsh continued, "let's discuss what we're looking at." The portrait before them was approximately 16 by 20 inches, housed in an ornate gilded frame that had seen better days. The daguerreotype captured a Victorian family arranged in the formal style of the era, father standing stoically behind a seated mother, with 5 children positioned around them in order of height. "The Pembroke family, 1873, Walsh stated, "found during the renovation of Blackmore Estate in Derbyshire last month. The estate has been abandoned since 1894 after the family's mysterious decline." Eleanor leaned closer. The father, Ambrose Pembroke, stood rigid in a high-collared coat, his hand resting possessively on his wife's shoulder. The mother, Catherine, sat with perfect posture, her face a mask of Victorian propriety, though Eleanor detected a certain tightness around her eyes. The children were arranged like decorative elements, 2 boys in matching suits, 2 girls in frilled dresses, and then there was the 5th child. Standing slightly apart from the others, partially obscured in shadow, was a small figure that seemed almost an afterthought in the composition. A child of perhaps 8 or 9 years, with features that were difficult to discern clearly. "What makes this portrait particularly interesting," Walsh said, tapping a gloved finger near the mysterious figure, "is that according to all family records, the Pembrokes had only 4 children. Perhaps a cousin or family friend?" suggested Ms. Clark. "We considered that," Bennett replied, "but the family ledgers are meticulous. Every visitor to Blackmore Estate between 1865 and 1894 was recorded. There's no mention of an extended stay by any child matching this description." Eleanor studied the child's face. Unlike the stiff poses of the other family members, this child's expression seemed almost knowing, as if sharing a secret with the viewer across the century that separated them. "The photography studio's records?" she asked. "Destroyed in a fire in 1885, Walsh said. "Convenient, isn't it?" Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I've spent 40 years studying Victorian photography," Walsh said, removing his spectacles. "And in all my experience, I've never seen anything quite like this. The composition, the technique, it's all period correct. But this child," he pointed to the shadowy figure, "this child doesn't belong." "Belonging is precisely what we're here to determine," Harrington interjected with a hint of impatience. "The National Gallery requires authentication before we can include this in the upcoming exhibition on Victorian family life. And the Historical Society needs confirmation of the portrait's provenance," added Ms. Clark. "The Pembroke family has significant historical importance in the region." Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off the mysterious child. There was something in that gaze that seemed to reach across time, directly to her. "Have you analyzed the photographic plate itself?" she asked. "That's why you're here, Dr. Blackwood," Walsh said. "Your expertise in photographic analysis and restoration is unparalleled. We need to determine if this portrait has been altered, or if there truly was a 5th child that history has somehow forgotten." Eleanor nodded, setting her satchel on a nearby table and retrieving her tools. "I'll need to examine it under the spectral light, and I'd like to review any materials recovered with the portrait." "There's a box of personal effects," Bennett said, gesturing to a conservation crate in the corner. "Letters, journals, household accounts. We've only begun to catalog them." "I'll start there," Eleanor said, The answer to who this child is might be found in the family's own words. Walsh nodded. We have 3 days before the exhibition committee requires our report. Whatever secrets this portrait holds, Dr. Blackwood, I trust you to uncover them. As the others began to disperse, Eleanor felt a peculiar sensation, as if the eyes of the unidentified child were following her movements. She dismissed the feeling as imagination, a trick of the light and shadow on the aged photograph. Yet when she glanced back at the portrait, she couldn't shake the impression that the child's expression had somehow changed, the hint of a smile that hadn't been there before. The institute grew quiet as evening deepened into night. Eleanor sat alone in the research room, surrounded by the personal effects of the Pembroke family. The contents of their lives laid bare before her. Catherine's delicate journals with their precise penmanship, Ambrose's business ledgers filled with figures and notes, children's school reports and correspondence with relatives. The rain continued its assault on the windows, creating a soothing background rhythm as she worked. A cup of tea had gone cold at her elbow, forgotten in her absorption with the materials. She had been methodically working through Catherine Pembroke's journals, starting from 1873, the year of the portrait, and working backward. The entries were largely what one would expect from a Victorian lady of means: notes on social calls, household management, the children's progress with their studies and music lessons. 4 children, always 4, Edward, the eldest, at 15 in 1873, then Margaret, 12, Thomas, 10, and little Louisa, just 6. No mention of a 5th child. Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes and reached for another volume, this one from 1870. As she opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. She retrieved it, carefully unfolding the brittle paper. It was a letter, written in a different hand than Catherine's, more urgent. The letters pressed deeply into the paper as if written with great emotion. My dearest Catherine, I implore you once more to reconsider. What you propose is against nature itself. Dr. Hartwell assures me his methods are sound, but I have seen the look in his eyes. There is something not right about the man or his practices. The grief you feel is natural, but this path leads only to darkness. Think of the children, our living children, who need their mother whole. Edward asks for you daily. Little Thomas has begun having nightmares. I beg you, let our little angel rest. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. With deepest concern and love, Ambrose. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. She carefully set the letter aside and continued through the journal. Catherine's entries from this period were sporadic and often incoherent, ramblings about shadows and whispers and the space between heartbeats. Then on November 18, 1870, a single line stood out in stark clarity. She has returned to us today. The next several pages had been torn out. When the journal resumed in January 1871, Catherine's writing had returned to its formal, controlled style. No mention of whatever had transpired in those missing pages, just the usual accounts of domestic life, with references to Edward, Margaret, Thomas, and Louisa. 4 children, always 4. Eleanor was so engrossed in her reading that she didn't hear the footsteps until a hand touched her shoulder. She startled, nearly knocking over her cold tea. Sorry, Bennett said, stepping back with an apologetic smile. Didn't mean to frighten you. It's fine, Eleanor said, her heart still racing. Just lost in 1870. Bennett pulled up a chair beside her. Find anything useful? She hesitated, then pushed the letter toward him. Maybe. It's cryptic, but something happened to the Pembroke family in late 1870. Something that caused Catherine great distress. Bennett read the letter, his brow furrowing. Dr. Hartwell. The name sounds familiar. I've been cross-referencing with the other materials, Eleanor said. He appears in Ambrose's account books from August to December 1870. Substantial payments listed only as professional services. A physician, perhaps? Or something else. Eleanor turned to an open ledger. Look at these household expenses from September 1870. Unusual purchases. Silver wire, specialized chemicals, electrical equipment. Not typical items for a Victorian household. Unless they were conducting experiments, Bennett suggested. The 1870s saw a fascination with spiritualism and pseudoscientific practices among the upper classes. Seances and table rapping were common, Eleanor agreed. But this seems more elaborate. She pulled out her notebook where she'd been organizing a timeline. Here's what I've pieced together. In early 1870, something happened that devastated the family, particularly Catherine. They engaged this Dr. Hartwell, who required specialized equipment. By November, Catherine writes that she has returned. She, one of the daughters. That's just it. Both daughters are mentioned consistently before and after this event. There's no indication either was absent. Bennett leaned back, considering. A miscarriage, perhaps? Or a stillborn child? Possibly. But listen to this entry from February 1871. Eleanor flipped to a page she'd marked. She grows stronger each day, though not as others do. Ambrose refuses to acknowledge her presence, but the children have begun to accept her as their own. Edward alone keeps his distance, watching from doorways but never approaching. Bennett's expression grew troubled. That's unsettling. There's more, Eleanor said. By mid-1871, Catherine stops referring to this presence directly. The family travels to London in spring 1873, and that's when this portrait was taken. She gestured to copies she'd made of the family's travel documents. 5 train tickets to London, 5 sets of accommodations at the hotel, yet officially only 4 children. A loud crack of thunder made them both jump. The lights flickered momentarily, then stabilized. I should check the portrait, Eleanor said, rising. I've set up the spectral analysis to run overnight. They made their way down the darkened corridor to the examination room. The portrait lay under a specialized camera that would photograph it under various light wavelengths, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. As they entered, Eleanor stopped abruptly. Something felt wrong. Did you move the portrait? She asked. Bennett shook his head. No, it should be exactly as we left it. Eleanor approached slowly. The portrait was indeed where they had left it, but something had changed. She leaned closer, studying the mysterious 5th child. Bennett, she whispered, look at the child's hands. In their earlier examination, the child's hands had been clasped in front, partly obscured by shadow. Now, one hand was clearly visible, extended slightly toward the viewer. That's not possible, Bennett said, his voice tight. Daguerreotypes don't change. No, Eleanor agreed. They don't. They stared at each other in the half-light of the examination room, neither willing to voice the implications. It must be a trick of the lighting, Bennett finally said. Or our memories playing tricks. Yes, Eleanor said, not believing it for a moment. That must be it. The spectral camera whirred softly as it continued its programmed sequence. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. Eleanor slept fitfully in one of the Institute's spare rooms, her dreams filled with Victorian corridors and the sound of a child's laughter echoing just out of sight. She woke before dawn, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her like cobwebs. In the dream, she had been in the Pembroke house, moving through rooms draped in funeral black. At the end of a long hallway stood a small figure, back turned. As Eleanor approached, the figure slowly began to turn. Just before she could see its face, she had awakened, heart pounding. Unable to return to sleep, she dressed and made her way to the examination room. The building was silent at this early hour, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The spectral analysis had completed overnight. Eleanor switched on the computer to review the results, trying to ignore the portrait that seemed to watch her from its position on the table. The first set of images appeared on screen, the portrait photographed under ultraviolet light, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. Eleanor leaned closer, studying the chemical composition of the daguerreotype. That's odd, she murmured to herself. The photographic plate showed subtle differences in chemical composition around the 5th child. Not evidence of tampering or addition, the chemical signature was consistent with 1870s photographic techniques, but different from the rest of the image, as if that portion had been exposed differently. She moved to the infrared images, which could reveal underpainting or changes in portraits. What she saw made her breath catch. The 5th child appeared more distinctly in the infrared spectrum, not less. While the other figures became slightly ghostly, the mysterious child seemed more solid, more present. Impossible, Eleanor whispered. A noise from the hallway made her look up. Footsteps, light and quick, passed by the door, too light for any of her colleagues. Hello? She called, moving to the doorway. The corridor was empty, but at the far end a door swung gently, as if someone had just passed through. Eleanor hesitated, then followed. The door led to the Institute's library, a vast room lined with shelves of books on art history, conservation techniques, and historical records. Is someone there? She called, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. No answer came, but as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she noticed a book lying open on one of the reading tables. She approached cautiously. It hadn't been there the previous evening. She was certain of it. The book was open to a chapter on post-mortem photography in the Victorian era, a common practice, especially for families who had lost children. The deceased would be posed, often with living family members, to create a final memento. But as Eleanor scanned the text, one passage stood out. In rare cases, particularly among practitioners of spiritualism, attempts were made to capture not just the deceased's earthly remains, but what was believed to be their spiritual presence. These revival photographs combine traditional photographic techniques with various spiritualist practices, often involving electrical currents, silver nitrate solutions, and arcane rituals. Such photographers claimed they could create a conduit through which the spirit of the departed could return, not just as an image, but as a presence that would remain tethered to the physical photograph. The book went on to describe a notorious practitioner of these techniques, one Dr. Edmund Hartwell. Eleanor's hand trembled as she read the name, the same Dr. Hartwell mentioned in Ambrose's letter to Catherine. According to the text, Hartwell had been ostracized by both the scientific and spiritualist communities for his extreme practices. He disappeared from London in 1868, rumored to have found patronage among wealthy families desperate to reconnect with deceased loved ones. "I see you found our friend Dr. Hartwell." Eleanor jumped at the voice. Professor Walsh stood in the doorway, looking as if he hadn't slept. "You knew about this?" she asked. Walsh entered the room, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I had suspicions. The Pembroke portrait has certain characteristics I've seen only twice before in my career, both times in photographs connected to Hartwell's work. Why didn't you mention this yesterday?" "Because such claims require evidence, Dr. Blackwood. I needed your unbiased analysis first." He gestured to the book. "Besides, Hartwell's work belongs more to folklore than scientific inquiry. Most academics dismiss accounts of his revival photographs as Victorian superstition." Eleanor thought of the child's hand that seemed to have moved in the portrait. "And what do you believe, Professor?" Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "I believe the Victorians understood more about the boundaries between worlds than we give them credit for. Whether through science or ritual, they sometimes opened doors." "Doors to what?" "That," Walsh said grimly, "is what we need to determine." By mid-morning, the entire team had reassembled in the examination room. Eleanor presented her findings from the spectral analysis, along with what she and Walsh had discovered about Dr. Hartwell. "So you're suggesting this is some kind of ghost photograph?" Harrington asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I'm not suggesting anything supernatural," Eleanor clarified. "Only that this portrait involves techniques outside conventional Victorian photography, techniques associated with Hartwell's work. The chemical analysis supports this," Bennett added, reviewing Eleanor's data. "The emulsion around the fifth figure contains traces of silver nitrate in a concentration not typically used in daguerreotypes of the period." Ms. Clark, who had been silently examining the portrait, spoke up. "There may be a simpler explanation. I've been researching the Pembroke family records more thoroughly." She opened a folder containing photocopied documents. "Hospital records from St. Mary's in London indicate that Catherine Pembroke gave birth to twin girls in 1864. Louisa, whom we know survived, and another daughter, Adelaide, who died of fever at age 5 in early 1870. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. "The timing matches," Eleanor said quietly. "Adelaide's death in early 1870, Catherine's subsequent breakdown, the engagement of Dr. Hartwell, and the mysterious return Catherine mentioned in her journal." Bennett finished. Walsh leaned over the portrait, studying the fifth child with renewed interest. Adelaide would have been 9 in 1873 when this portrait was taken, consistent with the apparent age of this figure. "But this is madness," Harrington protested. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that this photograph contains the what? The spirit of a dead child?" "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm simply connecting historical facts. The Pembrokes lost a child. In their grief, they turned to Hartwell, who was known for claiming he could reconnect families with deceased loved ones through photography. Whether his techniques actually achieved anything supernatural is irrelevant," Bennett added. "What matters is that this portrait appears to be one of his revival photographs, which makes it extraordinarily rare and significant from a historical perspective." Ms. Clark nodded. "The National Gallery and Historical Society would certainly be interested in such a unique artifact." "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, hesitating. "The portrait, I believe it's changing." She explained what she and Bennett had observed the previous evening, the subtle shift in the child's hand position. Harrington scoffed. Preposterous. Photographic plates don't change. Under normal circumstances, no, Walsh agreed. But Hartwell's techniques were far from normal. There are accounts of his photographs exhibiting unusual properties over time. What kinds of properties? Ms. Clark asked, suddenly looking uncomfortable. Changes in expression or position, Walsh said. Figures that appear to age, and in one documented case, a figure that gradually faded from the photograph entirely over the course of a year. Eleanor felt a chill at his words. The journal entries suggest Catherine believed she had actually brought Adelaide back, not just captured her image. What if Hartwell's techniques were designed to create more than a photograph? What if he was attempting to create a vessel, a way for the spirit to maintain a connection to the physical world? That's beyond the realm of scientific inquiry, Harrington said dismissively. Perhaps, Walsh replied, but it's not beyond the realm of historical inquiry. Many respected Victorians believed such things were possible, including, it seems, the Pembrokes. Eleanor turned to the portrait again, studying Adelaide's face, if indeed that was who the figure represented. There was a sadness in those eyes, but also something else. A question, or perhaps a warning. We need to examine the rest of the Pembroke records, she said. If this is Adelaide, we need to understand what happened after this portrait was taken, why the family's decline was so sudden in the years that followed. I'll continue with the technical analysis, Bennett offered, and I'll dig deeper into Hartwell's history, Walsh added. There may be other examples of his work that could help us understand what we're dealing with. As they dispersed to their various tasks, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that time was somehow running short, that by uncovering this mystery, they had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The afternoon passed in a blur of research. Eleanor immersed herself in the Pembroke family history, tracing their decline following the 1873 portrait. The pattern was disturbing. By 1874, Ambrose had begun drinking heavily, his business affairs falling into disarray. Catherine's journals became increasingly erratic, filled with references to Adelaide's hunger and the price of return. The living children fared no better. Edward was sent away to school in Switzerland in 1874, where he died in a climbing accident the following year. Margaret developed a mysterious wasting illness in 1876, lingering for months before succumbing. Thomas disappeared during a family holiday in 1878. His body was found weeks later in a ravine. The circumstances of his fall unclear. By 1880, only Catherine, Ambrose, and young Louisa remained. Ambrose shot himself in his study in 1885. Catherine was committed to an asylum in 1890, where she died still raving about what came back in Adelaide's place. Louisa, the sole survivor, sold Blackmore Estate in 1894 and vanished from historical record. It's as if the entire family was cursed, Eleanor murmured to herself. Not cursed, consumed. She looked up to find Professor Walsh standing in the doorway, his face grave. What do you mean? He entered, placing a worn leather journal on the table before her. Edmund Hartwell's personal diary, part of a private collection I once cataloged. I called in a favor to have it delivered. Eleanor opened it carefully. The pages were filled with diagrams, chemical formulas, and rambling text that veered between scientific notation and what appeared to be incantations. Hartwell believed the boundary between life and death was permeable, Walsh explained, that with the right combination of chemical catalysts, electrical stimulation, and what he called sympathetic yearning, a departed spirit could be drawn back. Back to what? A photograph? At first, yes. The photograph served as an anchor, a physical point to which the spirit could attach itself. But Hartwell's ultimate goal was more ambitious. Walsh turned to a page filled with frantic writing. He believed that over time, with proper nurturing, the spirit could strengthen its connection to our world. Eleanor read the passage Walsh indicated. The child subject proves most receptive to the treatment. The maternal bond creates a powerful sympathetic yearning that facilitates crossing. Initial manifestation remains confined to the photographic plate, but with each passing lunar cycle, the connection strengthens. The mother's vital energy feeds the process, an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice. Sacrifice? Eleanor looked up, disturbed. Hartwell's theory was parasitic in nature, Walsh said grimly. He believed the returning spirit drew energy from the living, particularly those with the strongest emotional bonds to the deceased. Like a mother grieving her child, Eleanor whispered. Precisely. Walsh turned to another page. His later entries suggest that with sufficient energy, the spirit could potentially achieve a more substantial return. You can't possibly believe this, Eleanor said. What I believe is irrelevant. The Pembrokes believed it, and the historical record shows that following this portrait's creation, the family suffered a series of tragedies that decimated them within a decade. Eleanor looked back at the portrait on the examination table. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, making the daguerreotype seem to shift and move as if alive. "Professor," she said slowly, "where's the child now?" Walsh followed her gaze. "What do you mean?" "In the portrait. Adelaide is gone." They both rushed to the examination table. The portrait remained as it was, the solemn Victorian family arranged in formal poses. But the space where the fifth child had stood was now empty, just a backdrop of shadow where a figure had been. "That's not possible," Walsh breathed. The lights flickered overhead, and a sudden chill permeated the room. "Bennett," Eleanor said urgently. "We need to find Bennett. He was continuing the analysis." A crash from the adjacent laboratory interrupted her. They rushed to investigate, finding Bennett standing amidst broken glass, his face pale. "It moved," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was examining a detail under the microscope, and it turned and looked directly at me." "Where's the portrait now?" Walsh demanded. "I left it under the microscope." Bennett pointed to the empty stage of the powerful electron microscope. It was right there. The three of them stared at the empty space, the implications too disturbing to voice. "We need to find it," Eleanor said finally. Now, the institute had grown dark as evening settled, shadows gathering in corners and doorways. The three of them moved through the corridors, checking each room methodically. "This is absurd," Bennett muttered. "A photograph can't simply walk away." "We're not dealing with an ordinary photograph," Walsh replied. "If my theory is correct, Hartwell created something that transcends conventional understanding." Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease. The Pembroke records indicate the family believed Adelaide had returned to them, not just as an image, but as a presence in their home, a presence that somehow fed on them. "You can't seriously believe," Bennett began. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Eleanor interrupted. "But something is happening here that defies rational explanation." They reached the main hall, its high ceiling lost in shadows. Rain continued to drum against the windows, occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning. "Dr. Blackwood," the voice came from behind them, Ms. Clark standing in the doorway to the research room. "I've been looking for you. There's something you need to see." They followed her into the room where Eleanor had spent the previous night reviewing the Pembroke journals. Ms. Clark pointed to a page she had discovered, a letter tucked into one of Catherine's later journals, dated 1889, a year before her commitment to the asylum. "My dearest Louisa, as the last of our family, you must know the truth. What we invited into our home was not your sister. Adelaide died pure and innocent. What returned wore her face but was something else entirely. Dr. Hartwell did not warn us that such doorways open in both directions, that what we perceive as the boundary between life and death is also a boundary between our world and something else, something hungry that waits for grief to create an opening. It has taken Edward, Margaret, and Thomas. Your father is gone by his own hand, but I know what drove him to it. The whispers, the cold presence in empty rooms, the knowledge of what we had done. I write this from what moments of clarity remain to me. The portrait is the key, the vessel through which it entered. It must be destroyed. Burn it, Louisa. Burn it and scatter the ashes in running water. Do not look upon her face as you do so, or she will know your thoughts. It is too late for me, but you may yet be spared. With all my remaining love, Mother." Silence fell over the room as they finished reading. "Did Louisa destroy the portrait?" Bennett asked finally. "Evidently not," Walsh replied. "Since we have it here, perhaps she tried," Eleanor suggested. "The frame shows evidence of fire damage on one corner. Maybe she attempted to burn it but couldn't complete the task. Or perhaps," Ms. Clark said quietly, "it wouldn't burn." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights went out, plunging them into darkness. "Nobody move," Walsh instructed. "There are emergency lights." Before he could finish, a soft glow appeared in the doorway. Not the harsh beam of emergency lighting, but a gentle, diffuse illumination that seemed to emanate from a small figure standing at the threshold, a child in Victorian dress. "Adelaide," Eleanor whispered. The figure remained motionless, face obscured in shadow despite the unnatural light surrounding it. Then, slowly, it raised one hand in a beckoning gesture and turned away, moving down the corridor. "We should follow it," Miss Clark said, already moving toward the door. That's exactly what we should not do, Bennett objected. This is madness. Madness or not, Walsh said grimly. That entity is loose in the Institute. We need to find it, and the portrait. Eleanor felt torn between scientific skepticism and the undeniable evidence before her eyes. I'll go, she decided. The rest of you stay here. Not alone, Walsh insisted. We stay together. The four of them moved cautiously into the corridor. The child's figure was visible at the far end, that same unearthly glow surrounding it. As they approached, it retreated around a corner. It's leading us somewhere, Ms. Clark observed. They followed the apparition through the darkened building, their path illuminated only by the spectral glow ahead and occasional flashes of lightning through the windows. The air grew increasingly cold, their breath visible in wispy clouds. The figure led them to the conservation laboratory, a large room filled with specialized equipment for the preservation and restoration of historical artifacts. In the center of the room, the portrait lay on an examination table, illuminated by a single beam of moonlight breaking through the storm clouds. The child, Adelaide, stood beside it, one hand resting on the gilded frame. As they entered, she turned to face them fully for the first time. Eleanor gasped. The face was that of a young girl, but the eyes were ancient, filled with a hunger that transcended human understanding. What do you want? Walsh asked, his voice steady despite the impossibility of the situation. The child smiled, a terrible expression that stretched too wide across its face. To live, it said, the voice a discordant mixture of childish sweetness and something far older. To feel, to grow. You're not Adelaide, Eleanor said. You never were. I wear her face, the entity acknowledged. I came through the door her mother opened. Such a powerful yearning. How could I resist? And now I've found a new family. It looked at each of them in turn, that horrible smile never wavering. The Pembrokes sustained me for years. Their fear, their love, their vital essence. But then they were gone, and I slept in the shadows of this portrait, waiting. Waiting for what? Ms. Clark asked. For someone to see me again, to wonder who I was, to seek me out. The child, the thing wearing Adelaide's form, stepped closer. And you did. You woke me with your curiosity, your fascination, your need to solve the mystery. Walsh moved protectively in front of the group. Whatever you are, you don't belong here. You must return to your own realm. The entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Why would I return to darkness when there is so much life here to consume? The Pembrokes were just the beginning. Now I am free again. It gestured to the portrait on the table. Looking closer, Eleanor realized with horror that all the figures in the family portrait were now gone. The photographic plate empty except for the Victorian backdrop. Where are they? She demanded. Here, the entity replied simply. With me. Always with me. Family is forever, Dr. Blackwood. As it spoke, shadowy forms began to materialize around it. The ghostly outlines of Ambrose, Catherine, and their children, their faces contorted in silent anguish. You've trapped them, Eleanor realized. All this time, not trapped, preserved, as they preserved me. The entity's glow intensified. And now, you will join our family. It lunged forward with inhuman speed, reaching for Walsh. The professor staggered back, clutching his chest as if in sudden pain. Professor, Eleanor moved to help him, but Bennett pulled her back. The portrait, he hissed urgently. Catherine's letter said it was the vessel, the doorway. We need to destroy it. Eleanor looked around desperately for something they could use. Her eyes fell on a container of chemical solvent used for cleaning photographic plates. Keep it distracted, she whispered to Bennett and Ms. Clark. As they moved to help Walsh, who had collapsed to his knees, Eleanor edged toward the chemical cabinet. The entity seemed focused on the professor, drawing closer to him with that terrible smile, shadowy hands extended. Such knowledge, it crooned. Such a lifetime of study and thought. You will nourish me well, Professor. Eleanor reached the cabinet and grabbed the solvent, uncapping it as she rushed toward the portrait. The entity sensed her movement and whirled, its childlike facade slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. No! It shrieked, lunging toward her. Ms. Clark intercepted it, grabbing a silver conservation tool from a nearby tray and thrusting it at the entity. The thing recoiled as if burned, giving Eleanor the moment she needed. She poured the solvent over the portrait, the chemicals immediately beginning to dissolve the photographic emulsion. The entity howled, a sound no human throat could produce. as the portrait bubbled and ran. "It's not enough," Bennett shouted. "Fire! We need fire!" He fumbled with a Bunsen burner connected to the laboratory's gas line, finally igniting it and passing the flame to Eleanor. Without hesitation, she touched it to the dissolving portrait. The chemicals caught immediately, blue flames engulfing the daguerreotype. The entity's scream reached a pitch that shattered beakers and vials throughout the laboratory. The shadowy forms of the Pembroke family seemed to stretch and twist, pulling away from the entity as the portrait burned. "Into the light," Eleanor found herself saying, though the words weren't her own. "Go into the light." As the portrait crumbled to ash, the Pembroke family's spirits seemed to dissolve, not into darkness, but into a gentle radiance that momentarily outshone the entity's cold glow. In that fleeting illumination, Eleanor saw Catherine Pembroke's face, no longer contorted in anguish, but peaceful, grateful. The entity that had worn Adelaide's form writhed and twisted, its shape becoming less human with each passing second. It lunged one final time toward them, but as the last fragment of the portrait dissolved into ash, the thing seemed to fold in upon itself, collapsing into a single point of darkness that winked out of existence, with a sound like a distant door slamming shut. Then silence, broken only by the storm outside and their own ragged breathing. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a harsh fluorescent glow over the laboratory. Walsh lay on the floor, pale but conscious, Bennett kneeling beside him. "Is it gone?" Ms. Clark asked, looking at the pile of ashes that had been the portrait. "I think so," Eleanor said, though uncertainty lingered. "The doorway is closed." Dawn broke clear and cool, the storm having passed in the night. Eleanor stood on the steps of the institute, watching as an ambulance took Professor Walsh to the hospital. The doctors had attributed his collapse to a minor heart attack, brought on by stress and exhaustion. "Will he be all right?" Bennett asked, joining her on the steps. "They think so. He's already arguing with the paramedics about being allowed to return to work tomorrow." They shared a smile, though it faded quickly as the events of the previous night hung between them. "What do we tell people?" Bennett finally asked. "About the portrait, the exhibition." Eleanor considered this. The truth, or part of it, that our analysis revealed the portrait was damaged beyond salvation. Chemical instability in the photographic plate led to its deterioration. And the fifth child, Adelaide? A mystery of Victorian photography that was lost before we could fully document it. Unfortunate but not unprecedented in conservation work. Bennett nodded slowly. "And the rest?" "What we saw?" Eleanor looked out at the morning light filtering through the trees, so normal and reassuring after the horrors of the night. "Some doors are better left closed," she said finally. "Some questions better left unanswered." Miss Clark emerged from the institute carrying her briefcase. "The Historical Society will be disappointed about the portrait," she said, "but perhaps it's for the best. The Pembroke family deserves its rest." Eleanor thought of Catherine's face in that final moment, the peace that had replaced decades of torment. "Yes," she agreed softly, "they do." As Ms. Clark departed, Harrington arrived, looking irritated. "I just heard about the portrait. A complete disaster. The National Gallery will require a full report on how such a valuable artifact was allowed to be destroyed." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I'll prepare all the documentation." "See that you do," Harrington sniffed, brushing past them into the building. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "He doesn't seem particularly traumatized by last night's events." Harrington left early yesterday evening, Eleanor realized. "He wasn't here when it happened." "Lucky him," Bennett murmured. They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. "What now?" Bennett finally asked. "Now," Eleanor said, "we go back to our ordinary work. We restore paintings and photographs that tell straightforward stories of the past. We forget about doorways between worlds and entities that hunger for life." Bennett nodded, though they both knew forgetting would be impossible. "One thing still bothers me," he said as they turned to re-enter the institute. "How did the portrait end up at Blackmore Estate during renovations? If Louisa Pembroke sold the estate in 1894, perhaps she couldn't bring herself to destroy it completely," Eleanor suggested, despite her mother's warning. Or perhaps what? Eleanor thought of the entity's final words before it vanished. "Family is forever." "Nothing," she said firmly. "It doesn't matter now. The portrait is gone. The door is closed." As they entered the building, Eleanor couldn't help glancing back at the morning light. For just a moment, she thought she saw a small figure standing beneath a distant tree, a child in Victorian dress, watching with patient, hungry eyes. Then she blinked, and there was nothing there but shadows. Eleanor turned away, closing the door firmly behind her. In the distance, a child began to laugh.